Horae Apocalypticae, Volume 1, an historicist commentary on the Revelation, updated and revised for the 21st century. Derived from the original work of E.B. Elliott. Updated, revised, and read by Nicklas Arthur. Preliminary Essays on the Genuineness and the Date of the Apocalypse of St. John. When a book of any interest or importance is set before you, there are two questions on which we may reasonably wish and expect information, preliminary to its perusal. First, who is the author? Second, when was it written? Especially if the work be one that claims to be of divine inspiration, as in the case of the Book of Revelation. I propose, therefore, in the following preliminary essays to answer these two questions concerning it. The first is one that has obviously a most important bearing on the book's inspiration, and consequently on its claim to any true prophetic character. The second is essential for correct interpretation. Essay 1. The author of the Apocalypse. Now on this point, a ready answer seems at once to meet the eye in the very text of the prophetic book itself, for the writer more than once enunciates his own name in it, John, and the authority which the several contexts imply to have attached to him. In one place, from the asserted fact of his being Christ's chosen medium for receiving the revelation and communicating it to the angels or presiding bishops of the 7 Asiatic churches. In another, from that of his pronouncing a blessing on those several presiding bishops. In another, from the prophets being spoken pointedly of as his brethren, is such as could scarcely belong to anyone named John, of less than apostolic dignity, insomuch that the very genuineness of the book seems almost involved in the fact of its writer being John the Apostle. Nor will the corroborative evidence that the text itself offers fail to affirm the inquiry, an evidence acknowledged even by the superficial and the prejudiced, in the holiness and superhuman sublimity of the composition. Should direct testimony further be sought for, as desirable, the well-known corroborative testimony of Irenaeus will be found ready at hand, a testimony express and various times repeated, as will presently appear, to the effect that the author of the Revelation was indeed that beloved disciple, the apostle and evangelist, St. John. And considering Irenaeus' own very clear era, relation to St. John and character, that he was an Asiatic Greek, born nearly about the time of St. John's death, that he was a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of John, and that he was moreover one of the most learned as well as most devoted of the Christian bishops of that age. His testimony will justly have been considered not only as of high authority, but as almost in itself conclusive on the point in question, indeed, as altogether sufficient and conclusive, except in case of the existence of some strong countervailing evidence. The fact is, however, that countervailing evidence of this nature has been asserted to exist. The genuineness of the Revelation has been questioned by ancient writers of eminence in the Christian Church, as early at least as the 3rd century. More especially, I may name Dionysius of Alexandria, and it has been questioned also by modern biblical critics of high reputation for learning and candor, among whom Michaelis stands preeminent. This renders it necessary that the point in question be more carefully looked into, and the evidence, as well as against as for, be examined in detail. At least it might be done by him who would wish to thoroughly satisfy himself on the grounds of our belief in the genuineness and divine inspiration of the revelation. I purpose, therefore, drawing out the evidence somewhat fully, and shall first, and with a view to the fairer conducting of the inquiry, set before the reader the strength and substance of the objections of these two authors, the most eminent, perhaps, respectively, of ancient and modern detractors. With regard to Dionysius, who was Bishop of Alexandria about the middle of the 3rd century, and the earliest critic of the apostolic authorship of the Apocalypse, this is most observable, that he did not impugn its ascription to the Apostle John on historical grounds. He did not allege the testimony of any more ancient writer against it. He did not thus argue, as did the later Michaelis. It is not preserved in the archives of the 7 Asiatic churches. The oldest person in those cities have no knowledge of its having been sent thither. No one ever saw it during the life of St. John. It was introduced in such and such a year, and contradicted as soon as it appeared." Unquote. It was simply on critical grounds, and internal evidence, that he rested his objection, reasoning from certain marked differences of style and diction between the Apostle John's Gospel and Epistles on the one hand, and the revelation of John on the other. Now the circumstance of a detractor so learned as Dionysius having thus failed to appeal to historical evidence, and of certain previous but evidently rash and intemperate skeptics, to whom he alludes, having equally failed to do so, nor, let me add, in this case, different with any of the other church fathers on the apostolic authorship in the next 2 centuries, constitutes, as Michaelis allows, a considerable, should I say, an exceedingly strong argument in favor of the high origin in question. For had such counter-evidence existed at the time, I cannot but believe that he would have alleged it. As to Dionysius's grand critical argument, just before stated, he who has marked the difference of style in the case of other sacred writers when simply writing history, and when wrapped by the Spirit into the enunciation of prophecy, I might exemplify in this case Moses, Isaiah, and St. Peter, will easily perceive the danger of deciding a question of identity of authorship simply on such grounds, and without the corroboration of external evidence. Not to add that there are observable certain remarkable points of similarity as well as dissimilarity between the writings thus brought into comparison. Indeed, such as to make Michaelis' suggestion, in explanation of the idea of the apocalyptic phraseology being in these points a forged imitation of that of St. John's Gospel instead. In similar manner, the evangelist's apocalyptic Hebraisms may be accounted for by reference to his very natural adoption of much of the language and style, as well as figures, of the old Hebrew prophets, when under the prophetic afflatus. Besides that the hypothesis is at least possible, in the absence of direct contradicting testimony, of his domestication in Greek Asia having occurred late in life, and his publication of the Apocalypse been made first, of the epistles and gospels afterwards. Nor let me here omit to observe that Dionysius himself, though incredulous as to the Apostle John being the author of the Apocalypse, had yet the conviction, in part derived from the holy character of the book itself, in part from its general reception in the Christian Church, that it was the writing of a holy man of that name, indeed of one inspired by God. It is Michaelis' judgment, however, that there exists over and above the internal evidence alleged by Dionysius, direct historic evidence also against the fact of the beloved disciple having been the writer of the Apocalypse, and indeed against its divine inspiration, referring to the two earliest of the Fathers, Ignatius and Papias, authors contemporary with St. John in his old age, and whose writings must be dated very soon after his death. He alleges that the former in his epistles still extant, though addressing in them 3 out of 7 apocalyptic churches, vis-a-vis those of Smyrna, Ephesus, and Philadelphia, does yet take no notice of anything written to those churches in the Apocalypse, and that the latter, notwithstanding his well-known and strong advocacy of the doctrine of the millennium, does yet, according to Eusebius, ground it only on unwritten tradition from the apostles, and not on the Apocalypse of St. John, as if he were either ignorant of it or disbelieved the book's divine authority. Thus, on the whole, Michaelis schemes to conclude that this book is a counterfeit production, introduced into the world after St. John's death, about the year 120, and perhaps between the times of Papias's and Justin Martyr's writings. Such is the substance of the chief objections of these two critics, who may fairly be supposed to represent the strength of the arguments against John, of ancient and modern critics. And I cannot but at once remark, with reference to them, that it is plain that both Dionysius, with his followers, in his time, and also Michaelis in his, conducted their inquiries not without a very considerable, though perhaps unconscious, bias a priori against the genuineness and apostolic origin of the Apocalypse. Its millennium doctrine could not but prejudice the Alexandrian bishop against it, considering that he was not only himself a strong anti-millennial in sentiment, but that it was in the act of writing against millenarians that he pronounced judgments against the genuineness of the Apocalypse. Again, the failure of expositors, in Michaelis's judgment, to show anything like a clear fulfillment of the apocalyptic prophecies, which yet, if the book were genuine and therefore inspired, he was persuaded, ought to have in great part been long before already fulfilled, operated, it seems, quite as powerfully to prejudice the German critic. Now, the unsoundness of these presumptions will, I hope, be made soon apparent. I trust in the ensuing historical exposition of the Revelation to prove, on such evidence as may satisfy both the cautious and severe expositor, that its predictions have indeed been fulfilled, and that with exactitude very remarkable. Moreover, I may perhaps, before its conclusion, being able to show that much of the objection felt by Dionysius and others, alike in ancient and modern times, against the millenarian doctrine, has been founded in misconception. For the present, it may suffice to repeat that what has been stated shows the importance, as was before said, of our looking more accurately and particularly into the actual historical evidence, whether against or for, on the point in question, especially into such evidence as those 3.5 centuries may furnish that elapsed immediately after the publication of the Apocalypse, that is, in the interval from near the end of the 1st century. Such will be proved to be the apocalyptic commencing date in the second of these preliminary essays, to the time of Dionysius, about the middle of the 3rd. The which division of the interval into 3.5 century offers, I think, a very convenient chronological classification of the Christian fathers and authors, whose testimonies to the Apocalypse of John we have to investigate. Nor will any but the first cause the least difficulty or detain us long. Roman numeral 1. as to the primary half-century ranging from 96 to about AD 150. It comprehends the last of those apostolic men who might probably have conversed with the apostles, vis-a-vis Ignatius, Polycarp, Papias, as well as one of very different and inferior authority, whom it may be well at once to examine and dispatch, Hermas. Number 1. I speak of the work of Hermas in this manner, under a full conviction of the correctness of Dr. Binton's judgment, both as to its age and character. Its age, as not long before the middle of the 2nd century. Its character, as most probably a counterfeit publication, palmed on the Christian Church, agreeably with the custom already at the time too prevalent, under the name of Hermas, a companion of St. Paul. Hence, even though the evidence of the writer's acquaintance with the Apocalypse of St. John be, as I think it is, conclusive, and indeed of his borrowing from it, just in the same manner that he does from the older and undoubted canonical scriptures of the New Testament, yet this will little help us in our present inquiry. Michaelis' theory, which we have to refute, being that the Apocalypse was a forgery, published after St. John's death, somewhere between the time of Papias and that of Justin Martyr, perhaps about AD 120, and consequently early enough for the so distant Sir Hermas to have been acquainted with it, while the mere judgment of this writer as to what was truly inspired scripture and what was not is of very little weight. But in another point of view I deem the work eminently to our purpose, and on that account indeed have made this mention of it, vis-a-vis, as showing us what kind of forgery of a sacred book of visions and revelations the Christian writers of that age were capable of, almost at their best, this being one very highly esteemed by the early Church. To a candid and sensible man, wanting time or opportunity for examining into the direct historic evidence of the genuineness and divine inspiration of John's Apocalypse, I scarce could advise anything, I think, more calculated to produce presumptive belief in its favor than simply that he should read one after the other, even if it were but for the space of one brief half-hour, the revelation of Hermas and the revelations of St. John.